think one of the key takeaways, which I think we find comfort in, is that there is planning and monitoring of the spread of the virus, and there's also research that's currently underway. And I think that has been the strength of South Africa's approach, not to sound as if we're exceptional, but that has been the strength, that there has been a lot of planning and a lot of sacrifices that has gone into how we deal with the pandemic, and particularly from everybody, not just from the political leadership, as we have seen in other countries, where the political leadership takes a stance and it's the citizens that pay a price. And here we are today talking about planning scenarios for 2021, particularly for schooling. So thank you for that. Like I said, if you've got questions or comments, the chat section is open. You're more than welcome to do that. We're noting them. And then at the end of all the panelist presentations, we will then take questions and comments. The next speaker needs no introduction. I think he has a familiar face. It's the Secretary General of SADTU, Mokoena Maluleka. He will have 5 minutes. I've got your slides, SG, unless you're going to share them, but I'll share them for you. And then once I've shared, let me just share them quickly. Then you can talk to those slides. So same procedure. Once you left with a minute, I'll switch on my video and you know it's time up. Okay. I'm going to
thanks so much, Chair and Facilitator of this important webinar today. Let me take this opportunity to really thank the frontline workers, to thank the teachers and the parents and the learners in our schools for having built resilience around this. And you can control that, Comrade Tshepo, for me, because I'm not going to be controlling anything. So we can go to the second slide, which basically is that few things around the challenges, because we are looking at the challenges for the schooling and teaching in 2021. The challenges are so many, but just categorize them in terms of: one, how would the school look like in 2021? Two, that what about the well-being of both the students and the teachers? And obviously that has also have the impact on the community, as Dr. Motsepe was presenting the models and the projection and so forth. And but also the other challenge is the curriculum delivery. We know that there will be a knowledge gap, there will be proficiency level gaps, but also what tools do we have to ensure that we know where we are and where to start. The assessment and clearly the challenges around infrastructure for learning. So yeah, the next slide, I deal with the issue of the challenge that is facing us in terms of how will school look like? Are we aspiring for us to go back to normal? In other words, there's no pandemic. The pandemic is gone because we are in level 1 or we're going to go to level 0 and so forth. The presentation by Doc is clear. It is that, look, the pandemic is still going to be with us, and therefore it then says there's a challenge for schooling and learning next year. In other words, teaching and learning will have got to confront these particular challenges. Now, and we don't want to aspire to go back to the normal because we know that the normal is not possible. Are we going to look at hybrid models as one of those particular areas as we respond to the challenge of how should this teaching and learning look like? Or are we going to have visual? Because then if it is going to be hybrid, it means we have to have learners in the classroom, some learners will be at home, or if it's going to be visual, it would mean that learners will only be receiving online teaching in terms of distance learning or in terms of collaborative learning and all those particular things. This is the challenge that is facing how we are going to then rethink and reimagine a school in 2021. So it is the things that when we're planning, we have got to, whatever model, whatever strategy that is going to be adopted, will have got to be informed by material conditions obtaining and obviously the peculiarities of particular areas and so forth. So the pandemic does not aspire that we stick to the normal because the normal is familiar and the normal is that we're in a box and we don't want to think out of the box. So it would mean that we need to improve the contact information. We need to know our learners, know their parents, how we are going to communicate with them. Should we adopt a hybrid or a virtual, or if we are going to adopt another model? Next slide. There we're dealing with the well-being. And I think this is the most important challenge that learning and teaching is going to be facing. Okay, we've got to address the issue of mental health of both our students and our teachers. And the question basically is going to be, can you be able to teach learners who have got anxieties, who have got social, emotional stress, and who have got academic challenges because they feel that they have not been able to cover particular issues and so forth. So these, as we plan, we need to look at those particular areas in terms of how are we going to address the lack of psychosocial services to respond to this particular mental health, because it's fundamental for me that we have got to teach the learners who are able to learn and they have the ability to learn. Hindering the ability to learn is going to be basically social, emotional, as well as mental health problem, because traumatic is devastating when a family member has passed on, and you need to be able to plan around those particular psychosocial support for all those who are at the level of the schools. How do we ensure that we continuously deal with those particular non-medical intervention or non-pharmaceutical intervention? Next slide. So the challenges around the curriculum is a lot of them that we know, but we need the rethinking around the curriculum, because the issue we're going to be facing as we're looking at the teaching and learning challenges is going to be the time available for us to be able to cover all proficiency levels in terms of each and individual learning area. So school and policymakers have got to have an adaptive mode that they adopt, because if they're going to be rigid, we're not going to be able to address the challenges that how do we ensure that we are able to address knowledge gap? Where do we begin? You have got learners who have been online, those who are not online, who have not been able to cover particular standards or particular proficiency level that are very critical in terms of competencies, in terms of the skills, in terms of knowledge, and so forth. Where do we begin next year? How do we ensure that we are able to plan for that? What tools are we going to be using? So basically we need data, and data will come out of what we have been able to do in terms of an assessment, whether it has been formative, whether it has been summative, and then assessment for learning. We've got to deal with those issues. Now, the anxieties will impact on how we are going to be able to deliver the curriculum and so forth. So we need transitional measures where we are able to say, are we able to go and make sure that the teacher that was with these learners will also be with the very same learners, or a collaborative situation where you are able to lessen the anxieties, lessen this particular social, emotional stress on the learners by making sure that they don't have got to start with a new teacher immediately. If they start with a new teacher next year, the teacher must, the old teacher, the one who was with them, must work with the new one in order to ensure that they identify where they are, how do we move forward, and so forth. So the next slide, which I think is the last. The issue of assessment, I have touched on that because this is a tool that we have got to make. But I want to make an emphasis. If we are going to, again, want to aspire to go back to the normal, where the testing was the norm, was the issue that we were relying on, the pandemic does not want us to rely on. You cannot test a learner who has been traumatized. You cannot test a learner who needs to be supported mentally, who has got to be supported throughout. So we need to really look at how these orthodoxies can be changed so that we look at the assessment for learning, formative and continuous learning that is not going to be stressful, that is not going to cause more problems. So again, I'm bringing in the issue of evidence. In other words, you need scientific evidence to be able to continue to be doing what you want to do. If you are going to be religious or military in terms of just compliance and accountability, we are not going to be able to address the challenges that we are going to face around assessment. So we need to relook, rethink, reimagine assessment based on conversation between us and our learners and the student. The last slide, I think. I know I keep on saying last, and sometimes the last may not be the last. And this last is the infrastructure and the resources. And in there, basically, is about the environment that we need to create. Secondly, is the issue of the budget, the austerity measures. How are we going to ensure that the sanitizers are still going to be there, that we're still going to have the masks and so forth, but also, are we going to address the issues that are affecting our learners with disabilities in our schools? And what about the glaring disparities that we have seen in terms of ablution, water, and everything else and so forth? These are the challenges that we have got to plan around, and therefore the managers and our policymakers have got to do that. Thank you so much, and I want to thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, SG. I think key takeaways there that are coming out is definitely around the mental health of our learners, the mental health of the teachers. But I think as the webinar is concerned, looking into 2021, the academic year. And I'm just reminded of how we were guided by science to get to where we are right now. And I think that's an important point you make, that let us be guided by science, let us be guided by evidence. Because I remember that there was a time when we were considering, there were those who were saying, throw away the schooling year and let's start afresh, as if the pandemic will not be around by the time we come back in 2021. And I'm glad that the education sector was guided by the science, as led by scientists such as Dr. Motsepe, and the unions with their members took it upon themselves to make sure that our schools function to some extent. And the points that you raise, I think, speak to the reality that we ought to confront beyond this. I normally hear people saying COVID exposed inequalities. I don't think it exposed them, but we know what it has done. It has shown us that we need to fast track our commitment. The next speaker is Basil, and I think it captures, the flow is quite nice because it captures what the reality of schooling is from SATU and NAPTOSA, who deal on a daily basis with those who are entrusted to teach almost 13 million of young people in the country. Basil, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tshepo. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to reflect briefly on the lessons that school leaders have learned, and of course, the type of impact this has had this year and in 2022, and if any of these things, these lessons learned, can be carried over. Now, let's begin by acknowledging that everybody has learned a lot, and none as much as those people who were suddenly entrusted with doing something that they had never ever signed up for. And they never thought that in their lifetime they would have to do something like this. And they were faced with a myriad of problems. And just to enumerate a few, where the learning really took place. The first thing was the management of staff, which was very, very different. And the management of illness, that was very, very different. And you would see now, as we've heard how the pandemic has declined, or infection rates have declined, that even now a sense of calm has settled into our schools, where the closure of schools, etc., is no longer with us. So one of the key takeaways has been how to manage people better, and how to ensure that if you have a sense of calm, that calm will spill over not only to the teachers, but to the learners, and of course to the broader community. But it was in the management of the teaching and learning where the greatest learning took place. First of all, it was the nightmare with the curriculum. And to be generous with the DBE, they also didn't know what was going on. And they planned a lot together with the unions. And every time they thought they had finished planning, the dates and times were shifted. But it is at the school level where the most learning took place. And if this is not what the DBE sees today, then they will never learn from it. Because the only people that know really how much was covered, how much of the curriculum was covered, and in particular, what key concepts have not been covered that need to be carried over to 2022. Only the individual schools actually know this. There is an assumption that schools would have done certain things, but that is just exactly what it is, an assumption. So unless we get closer to the schools and we respect the integrity of the professionalism of the people at schools, and we consult them, we will not take this any further. And for our school leaders, this has been the most important thing. Now, just to spend a few more seconds on the whole story of the key concept gaps that have come out. Our principals, our management teams know what those are. Our teachers know. And if we don't plan sufficiently for them to be added into 2021, then we are going to be in grave trouble. But now remember, we constantly talk about having time to do this. But we have grade 11s and grade 12s where we don't have that time. And that is why that consultation with the people at the chalk face becomes so necessary. Mugwena made reference to PPEs and the reality that the year is not going to be free-flowing and back to normal. One of the things that our heads have learned, and our management teams, is that the unreliability of the people out there, the suppliers, the DBE itself. And they've had to make many plans, and we will be on them again about how we manage protecting our teachers and protecting our children. Because after all said and done, that is key. The protection of health and welfare being key. And I'm not going to make the point about the mental health because I think it has been made well enough. However, the one thing that will haunt us, continue to haunt us, is infrastructure and overcrowding. Even when we had the 50% models, we found that some schools were still overcrowded with just the 50%. Now that problem is not going to disappear come 2021. The question is, what are we going to do about it? And here is where school leaders are now looking at the DBE and saying, we need your help. But now we are handing over monies to other entities, and that means that there will be no infrastructure development. And that is going to hit schools very hard. What about the ablutions which have to do with the health and welfare? But I've made my point there. But to come back to teaching and the mixed modalities of teaching, we've now had about 7 months of COVID. We've seen how the schools that have resources have managed to be relatively unaffected. And the schools that didn't have, we have now plunged our matriculants into an examination where many of them are probably not fully ready. Not because they didn't have teachers that worked. Those teachers worked themselves to the bone. Not because they were not learners that wanted to work. They've worked, but in fact because they were robbed of time and through no fault of their own. What are we doing about that? The biggest question our school leaders are asking today is, what are we doing about that? What plans have we made? We know we can't give everybody an instrument, but there are data issues. There are center issues where when learners are not at school for a particular time, they could go there. And I'm not talking about lockdowns. I'm talking about when we have the mixed modalities of being at school for part of the time and being at home. So at the moment, we are up in the air in terms of exactly how the curriculum must be trimmed, and it must be. We are still talking about how we will constantly supply the PPEs, the accommodation, and remembering that competencies for the future, creating global citizens, and of course, foundational learning, mathematics, reading will not disappear. They are still the primary goal of teaching and of school leaders who want to take us into 2021. Tshepo, I thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Sure. Some very tough questions that Isel has asked around what competencies are we setting up for the future, and I guess that's the key thing around the campaign that we've been running as Phepha uFunde, supported by the Solidarity Fund and the Zenex Foundation, has been laying the foundation for us to be able to deal with any future pandemic that we might encounter. That let this not be a once-off where teaching and learning is interrupted and we just build for the sake of building for now, but build for the future as well. And I think that's very important. And one of the things I'd like to refer people to is to the Phepha uFunde website, which some of the podcasts do address some of the questions and comments, but I guess it's also an important some of the important discussions that have taken place, which you can listen to when you have the time. So I'd like to move on to our next panelist, which is Tanako, who is a counseling psychologist and researcher with 31 years of experience in education and psychology. And her recent work has focused on violence in schools. Tanako, I'm going to share your presentation, and then when you're ready, you can go. Let me just find it. I've got so many things open. Let me just find it quickly. I'll share it now. I'll share it now. Not happening.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, can start talking to it, and then I'll share it as
okay. All right. While you're doing that, maybe I should take the time to greet all the participants and the fellow panelists and say good afternoon. And also appreciate the leadership from the respected union leaders. It is always an honor and a pleasure to me sharing a platform with you both. And having said that, I am also glad that people are talking about difficulties that may be awaiting the education system in 2021. I was a little apprehensive that people might think that I am pessimistic as I have to answer the question, what will stress be like in schools in 2021? And sadly, I do not bring exciting and good news as people might have been hoping for. So the question is, will the 2021 academic year to 2021? Those changes will determine whether stress will come down or stress will go up. The nature of stress works like this. It is a psycho-emotional response to increasing psychological pressure and poor coping skills. If I may just speak through the slides, but you'll have to flip them because I thought I wanted a slide to be like 1 minute. So I will just move quickly through the slides and come back for a discussion. So can we move to the next slide? So if pressure increases and people have poor coping skills, that results in stress. So if we want to reduce stress, we may have to do two things. Positive change to life events, and I'm not hearing that COVID-19 will be in our past anytime soon. So that may not change. I'm not hearing that curriculum deficits will be addressed anytime soon. So that they may not necessarily be a positive change in that area. And if there is no positive change in life events, they stay as they are, then positive change should focus on coping skills, improve coping mechanisms, and build resiliency. That way you get people to deal better with stress. Next slide, Tshepo. So, when we do not do what we are supposed to do, stress will not go away. And when people do not engage in positive coping mechanisms, negative and undesirable coping mechanisms will kick in. And those would be in a school context, be it with adults as in educators and leadership, or be it with learners, absenteeism. People might cope by running away, anxiety, people want to run away from situations that cause them fear and anxiety. And we might see an increase in absenteeism levels if we are not seeing it already. And if we were seeing it in 2020, nothing much has changed. So we might continue to see absenteeism levels rising in 2021. Anger and violence. When people are frustrated and when people are threatened, COVID is a life-threatening situation. They might want to fight, they might want to take things into their hands. And this has happened in one or two examples that I may give, and they are in the public arena. So I will be more I am comfortable sharing those. One learner came to school without a mask on. There was anger in that situation, and you can tell by the way the school handled the situation. The learner was sent back home, and they were raped on the way home because now they were alone and isolated and vulnerable. In another instance, a learner came to school, she was asthmatic, she didn't put her mask on as could be expected. And we see anger again in that situation. The learner was beaten up, I think with a steel pipe, ended up in hospital, injuries to her spine. So we don't have any reason so far to think that we will see less of anger unless something happens. If nothing changes, we will see rising levels of anger, and that more anger might come with disappointment. Disappointment that we thought COVID-19 we would be in control by now, but still there is a second wave coming. People will have more lockdowns, more restrictions and all that. So anger might be a little prevalent than we may expect. Anxiety, of course, and substance abuse. When people feel threatened, they want either to run away to substances, more so with teenagers and adults than younger children. Younger children, we might see regression in behaviors, difficulties in following instructions and all that. So to predict stress with a measure of accuracy for 2021, we can ask ourselves the following questions. Has psychological pressure on parents, teachers, and learners been reduced? If it has been, I would say not significantly. Have life events resulting in current levels of stress, have they changed and changed for the better? Hardly so. If we think about the work that was not done, the curriculum delivery, the teaching that wasn't done in 2020, the carryover, people are talking about deficits. The deficits in learning, couple that with regression and couple that with historic regression, with historic deficits. So what we will see in January, especially with the younger learners, they will have even the basics, what would be expected of them. They will have that lost to closures and all that. I see Tshepo coming up. So have we improved coping skills? Have we been out there in the schools with psychoeducation, providing psychoeducation to teachers what to expect, how to pick up these behavioral issues and how to deal with them? Have we seen the snares outreach programs going out there? Have we seen rigorous EAP and wellness programs to schools and parents? I think we can all answer this. There hasn't been much. There hasn't been much that has been done in combating and reducing stress. Last slide, hopefully. Next slide, Tshepo.
I'm trying to share it. It's not moving. Let me just stop sharing.
You are going to have to give me injury time.
Oh my goodness.
I'm going to ask for injury time here. All right, let me see if I can do it.
Why is it not moving? Technology is letting me down. Let me share it again and see. There we go.
Okay.
There's the last slide.
Last slide. There it is. Okay, so a few things. So what would we say leadership can do? Halt as in stop. Prepare for the worst and keep hoping for the best. If the answer to the questions I asked earlier is no, so there is no basis to expect differently, to expect that stress among teachers and educators and parents will be less in 2021. We absolutely have no basis to expect less levels of stress. So the most likely sources of stress will be curriculum delivery, teaching, realizing that you did all the work in 2021, in 2020, but that work is lost. And you, as a teacher, with all that I had Comrade Mugwena say, with all that I had Basil say, teachers will still realize that both of us, we are here teaching and co-teaching, but still the deficits and the losses that happened with the homeschooling and staying away, they might be overwhelming to teachers. And when learners and teachers are not in a good mood, unhappy teachers make unhappy learners. So you can expect the anxiety in the teacher to translate into behavioral problems in their classroom. And frustrated teachers are not the happiest teachers to lead as a school principal. So we have to expect behavioral problems from adults and from teachers, especially if there are no coping positive mechanisms taught. So the easiest or the most common used stress management technique is to halt, stop, check the hunger, check the anger, check the loneliness, and the exhaustion. The exhaustion I'm talking about may be emotional exhaustion and psychological exhaustion. There is a lot that has got to be done. Lots of work has got to be done. I don't know, I'm happy to have two unions, big unions here, and I'm wondering if the unions have thought about, because I know they do have gender desks, they do have other desks. I wonder about psychosocial support desk, not EAP. I know unions do get employee assistance programs and wellness programs. I'm just wondering about the union having a psychosocial desk to coordinate delivery of psychosocial support and help in schools with the department and with every other provider there is out there. That's why I'm going to stop for today. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Dr. Nako. And I think this leads us to the last presentation by Dr. L. Witten. And one of the first episodes of the Phepha uFunde campaign, Dr. L. Witten spoke quite passionately about leading with compassion. And I think his presentation that would look at what you think should be done by school leadership in preparation for the uncertainties of the new year will give us a sense as to how we deal with some of the things that you have raised. Dr. L? Dr. Witten?
Thank you, Tshepo. Good afternoon, colleagues. Good afternoon to everyone, and especially good afternoon to my fellow panelists. Let me just commend them for the inputs. I think this is a really important discussion that we're having. And I believe that as we are engaged in it, we are all learning. So thank you for having me. I'm going to move quite quickly through my slides, and I'm hoping to build off some of the things that have been raised here by my colleagues in their own inputs. So we are living through a crisis. We are living in a time of uncertainty. And during times like this, leadership matters. It matters more so now than ever before. And my pitch is around the importance of leaders and school leaders in trying to hold things together as they move to close out this year and to start up the new year. So I'm going to start, Tshepo, can I go? Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, here we go. So our schools, with reopening, have actually become the education system's frontline sites, at the forefront of engaging in the core processes of teaching and learning, but in a context that is very, very different, and where, you know, the pandemic is ravaging and you know, really hitting communities, and where they have to keep the schooling processes going. So they've been at the forefront of the struggle for education, especially during this past year. They also have been called upon to make the most changes. So if we think about it, many of us have, you know, learned a bit of online stuff. We got behind Zoom, MS Teams, and we continue doing a lot of our work. Schools have to physically go back and make the most changes. And the changes for schools have been physical, but it's also been with the curriculum. It's also been mentally and emotionally that we engage with all of this. So our schools have been really, really not only at the forefront, but they've had to make the most changes. These changes also occur in very, very complex challenges that are part of their location in communities. When we talk about the changes, I refer to these changes as disruptive change. And it's disruptive because firstly, it came unannounced. It was sudden, it was thrust upon us. It's also disruptive because it was imposed from the outside. It was immediate. It was compulsory. We had no choice. We had to change. It was based on uncertainty. And of course, the changes that schools had to make have been very, very complex. So colleagues, and all of us on this webinar, I want us to appreciate what schools have gone through and what they're currently still going through. And I want us to think about ways in which we can support our schools more effectively. So I've also noticed that in November, there's been no major disruption to the schooling processes since reopening. There's been no major closing down of schools or shutting down in certain areas. We know that there have been lots of incidents of cases that have emerged, and schools in the context have responded to it. But in the main, we've been actually fortunate that our schools have been able to continue working over the last few months. And for that, we need to commend them. So what I see in our schools right now, if I can classify that quickly, I would say they were adaptable, they showed innovation, they showed agency. And by agency, colleagues, I just mean the ability of an individual or a group, teachers in the school, the staff, to act on the situation and to change it. And lastly, our schools showed resilience. And that is why I said we have to commend them for having reopened, having started, even though it's a different kind of functionality, having started the schooling processes and getting thus far. I think it's been a great achievement. So quickly, a concept that we are working on, especially with our school leaders, to help them lead more effectively in the schools and across the communities. We say that during times of crisis and uncertainty, leaders have to play a key role in holding. Now, holding is a psychological term, and it's about creating a safe space. It's about creating a framework where people feel that they can come together, share what they're going through, and still continue to do their work. So for school leaders, there are two types of holding. The first holding is what we call, let me just say this first. So holding is a mechanism to make sense of reality. So what's going on? What's going on around us? What's going on in our school? What's going on in the world? It's also used to soothe the stress, and I don't need to speak about that. My colleague just before me spoke about that so beautifully. And also to help people in the organization adapt to new conditions to continue moving forward. So that's a really important leadership role that is taken on during times of crisis and uncertainty. And it has two aspects. The first is what we call institutional holding. I'm not going to go through all of that, but that is around how the leader works with the SMT, works with the teachers, the rest of the staff, and with the parents to put together a school program that still manages to move on. The leader has to do that to create some stability in the organization, because there are already high levels of stress and anxiety, and where there is chaos in the school, it just heightens those levels of stress and anxiety. So that's an important role that leaders play. They've been doing it thus far, and they most probably will be doing it in the new year. The second kind of holding, and this is a very important kind of holding that leaders play, colleagues. Leaders have to also exercise what we call interpersonal holding. And here we have to become more conscious as leaders to create a culture of care and support, to hold our organization, but also our colleagues in it together. And with schools, it's so important that, you know, before you even start a day, let's develop some check-ins or rituals that have meaning, where teachers can connect to each other, can talk to the leadership team, where teachers in classes can do that with learners, and they can just check in on how they're doing. We cannot ignore the psychosocial effects of what's happening, colleagues, especially in our schools. And so the concept of interpersonal holding is really, really important. And so leaders, we encourage them to play these two important roles, to continue to hold the school together as an organization. And we know there are lots of new changes that they have to bring in, but also at the same time, to look at how we can create a culture of care and support in our schools. So preparing for next year, I'm going to go through very quickly. I think the first thing we have to do is to celebrate that we actually came through this year. Celebrate not that the pandemic has passed, but celebrate that we managed to get our schools to remain functional up until the very end. A part of that celebration, colleagues, would also be remembering and honoring. I just had a very sad call yesterday from the school in PE. A principal and the deputy principal that we worked with there passed away from COVID-19. The leadership team cutting off. Right? So we celebrate in terms of what we have achieved, and we celebrate what we've gotten through, but we also remember and we honor those who are no longer with us. And it's not only about our school colleagues, it's also about our family members. That's really important. Second important thing we do for next year, we reflect. What did we learn? Our colleagues earlier spoke about, you know, all the different kinds of lessons. What did we learn? How are we going to respond to some of the lessons, especially in terms of things that we may want to change or may want to do better? So this is an important part of what leaders do, especially as we move to the closing of the year. What have we learned from what has happened this year and the way we've run our schools, and what can we improve and do better next year? And then the last part is to plan, of course. So I have also been kind of focusing, Tshepo, I'm almost done, on the role of the school leaders, especially going into the future. And I want to put forward 3 C's. It's called care, curriculum, and community as the focus of school leaders. We say that the school's culture of care underpins and enables teaching and learning in a school, because learners, when they are ensconced in a relationship of care and support and love, they're going to learn more effectively. We also say that community, we bring together stakeholders, and it's not only parents. We bring together all kinds of stakeholders to help support with the learning and development of children, both within school and outside of school. And so my last slide, I'm going to raise as a question, colleagues, because I think it's important that we ask it, especially in the light of some of these challenges that we've mentioned earlier and that we know is happening in our schools. My belief is that we cannot expect schools on their own to address these challenges. We cannot do that. It's unfair to them, right? They've been working on their own very hard at great costs to themselves. We cannot leave them on their own. How do we support them? What we're going to need, and this is where we're going to have a bigger conversation, is a purposeful and coordinated societal response to dealing with some of these ongoing challenges. And so that's the work of the future that not only our schools must do, but all of us in terms of society. How do we come around our schools and build networks of support that hold our learners together? Thank you, Tshepo.
Thank you very much, Dr. Woodson. As always, I think it's the critical questions which you ask while also reminding us of what it would take for schools to function better. With that said, I'd like to, this is the exciting part of any webinar that I've attended, is the Q&A. We've heard from the panelists their thoughts on what possible scenarios can play out and what interventions we can put in place for 2021 to make sure that this, schools are safe spaces for teaching and learning. We've got 2 questions that I'm going to read out. And like I said, I will take 4 live questions. Please raise your hand in the chat. Please, next to your name, you'll see those little 3 dots. I think you can raise your hand from there. If not, okay, I can't raise my hand. Please raise your hand. We've got 2 questions, which are, the first one is for Dr. Motsepe, around the study which you mentioned, other insights from the home studies on children and the spread that we can share yet. Is there any school-specific data on the spread that we can refer to? That's for Dr. Motsepe. Did you get that? Did you get the question? Great. And then the second question is from Lauren. Thank you, SG, for letting us to the challenges that teachers are facing specifically. How do you think we can best help learners manage the transition from one grade to the next grade, given that they will be facing a new teacher who will inherit the learning deficits, and not just from 2020, but historically too? Yeah, that's a very important question. And I'd like to open up this question to both Mokoena and Basil as leaders of the 2 teacher unions. Can you just think about it? And I'm hoping that we don't get the same answer on this question. I'm going to check my chat if there's any hands. And then in the meantime, Dr. Motsepe, the floor is yours on that question.
Thank you for the question. So when we look at the prevalence rates, when we look at the cases that have been reported thus far, we don't see children playing a key role within the COVID outbreak. So by that, I mean, when we look at the proportion of children that have been infected with COVID-19 and have accessed healthcare services, it is not a significant number. Even when you look at the community screening that was done on the onset of the outbreak, because what was happening is that they would pick index cases from the hospitals, and then they would follow up those cases in the households to look at people who are contacts who have been infected by that index case. We still did not see a significant proportion of children being infected by COVID or contributing to the COVID outbreak. That having been said, we still need more data really looking at the role that children play in terms of passing it on. So in as much as we're not seeing them contributing significantly to the case burden, it might be possible that maybe they do contribute to transmission in one way or the other. And unfortunately, the study has just started and we don't yet have data that's looking at that. The studies that have been done in Europe looking at transmission of COVID have not necessarily focused on children. So that's the uniqueness of the study that we're doing here in South Africa within our unit, because it zooms in to really look at children, the infection rates in children, and the role that they play in passing on the disease further. However, if we look at our case fatality rates within schools, there's data that's filtering in from schools in terms of teachers getting COVID in the school environment itself. That is also not a significant contribution to the COVID outbreak. So we can say with a certain level of certainty that we don't think children are the major drivers of the COVID-19 outbreak at this stage. And even if we look at statistics, I'm going to give reference to the data that we're getting from Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital. Our pediatric wards and units were actually at their minimum during the COVID period, and even now post-COVID, showing that the infection rates within children is very low. If they're indeed getting infected and they remain asymptomatic, that also supports the hypothesis that children don't spread it more, because we know that asymptomatic cases do not spread the disease as much as those who present with symptoms. So all that taken together actually is pointing towards children not playing a major role within the COVID transmission. But up until with the empirical data from these studies that specifically look at transmission and the contribution that children put into the pot, we can't say with 100% certainty, but we can speculate around the data that is already coming up.
Thank you very much, Doc. I think that's quite helpful, particularly when we're thinking of what to expect next year. SG, then Basil.
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. Really, it is that there's a theory that says that a teacher who has been with the learners in the last quarter or in the last term can be with that learner in order to manage that particular transition. However, the practicalities in our schools is that that may not be possible. So what we would advise, and clearly we still need to have a lot of learning around these particular issues, is where we bring in collaborative professionalism in the level of the school, where the teacher who is taking these learners with this knowledge gap or these deficits that the doc was talking about, it then works with the new teacher and say, this is how far we have been able to address the proficiency levels. Some people, they call that standards and so forth, and then says, this is what was required to be covered, and then it's not been able to be covered. So basically, you are bringing the level of analysis of data that is there at the school level. Like Basil was saying, if it is going to be somebody else who's going to come from nowhere else and says, no, look, this is where the learners are in terms of where you have got to start, that will be a false start, because you've got to allow that professional capital that the teachers possess to be able to make that judgment, and therefore only collaborative professionalism is the answer here, where people sit and plan and say, we have assessed this particular grade 10 is going to grade 11, and teacher B is going to be there. So teacher A has got to then be working together with teacher B for a particular period, because things have changed and we don't want to aspire to go to the normal. We need to go to a new normal where solidarity and working together is very, very important as we are approaching this. That was not the only question, basically, in terms of the transition. The other issue was that, how do you ascertain this particular gap? Clearly, from the assessment that we have done, from the schedules that are there, we are then able to allow each and every teacher to say, as and when we were doing formative assessment and summative assessment, then we were then able to identify that 45% of the work that we're supposed to do have not been able to do. So we've been able to cover 55%. So therefore, in the planning, that is factors that into the new year, into the planning, and say, how best do we spread in order to cover the work that we could not be able to cover in terms of skills, in terms of knowledge, in terms of attitude, and so forth. No, don't do that mechanically, because education is not mechanical. We're dealing with human beings here, and therefore it means learners' feedback and learners' interaction and conversing with them also comes into the picture, so that you are then able to address their social, emotional, and mental health status as you move there. There's another question, Tshepo, maybe I must hijack this particular time.
please be crisp.
I was reading the questions that were asked on the other side, because we were advised by NAPE to check where the other it was about the technology. So when we talk about how will the school look like in 2021 and in future, it is that if the school is not going to be normal, in other words, you're going to have to adopt a hybrid model of where there is a surge, there will be learners who are at home, and therefore they need to be taught. Therefore, that brings in teacher development to say, how do we teach and train the teachers to be able to use technology as a resource, okay, and as a support and as a learning material, and not as a form of replacing a teacher, but then you use that particular technology to do that. And hence I said, you then have to improve the data that is there at the level of the school in terms of the contact with the learners, because you will find that in a school, maybe 80% of the learners have got cell phones. Of course, we say they must not use their cell phones in the school, but they do have them. And therefore, you need to leverage on what they have to be able to send them information, lessons that they can look at, and so forth, and then look at the gap at which, who are the learners who do not have these particular gadgets, and so forth, and then you address that particular issue. But we're doing this, hitting the ground running, because we believe that planning must start now. And as we will be demanding for more gadgets to be given to the teachers, given to the learners, we need to use what we have currently. So I'm responding to the issue of technology. The technology will not just improve the teaching, but it can only improve the teaching if you train the teachers to be able to use the right technology for that, because not everything online, not everything that is called e-learning or distance learning is suitable for all environment and all conditions and so forth. So it's going to depend on the assessment of the school management and the teachers and the parents to say, this can work, this cannot work, and therefore we do that. So I thought I needed to do that. But solidarity to all our teachers, and let's pledge that support for them, because really they are going to be faced with a lot of planning in November and December. Thank you.
Thank you, SG. Basil?
Thank you. At first, let me just start towards the end about how do we ascertain the gaps that are there. First of all, it is the teachers who know what gaps there are. After all said and done, they've taught the work. And if we have the collaborative approach where all the maths teachers in the school are talking to one another, they will know what the key concepts are, first of all, and secondly, what has been taught and what hasn't been taught. So automatically, the one teacher is helping the next teacher, because it is about helping the teacher, because if we help the teacher, we help the children as well. But now remember that some teachers haven't ever taught some of these things because they've been locked into certain grades. And that is the only way we start identifying where those gaps lie, even with the teachers. But insofar as assisting learners in managing transition gaps, remember, the learner only knows that they have a gap when once they have to learn something else, but there's something missing for them to understand the next thing. And that is why it is the teachers who need the training. I want to go further to talk very briefly about a thing I've mentioned in terms of online lessons, etc. If we use the 50% model like we have now, one of the key lessons learned is that you can't have children away from school for 1 week and then back a week later. It has to be a model that is different, where you see children more often. But we've also learned that you can't have children do nothing during that time. And unless we bridge that gap, we will end up with a greater deficit in the next year. The hard lesson now that has been learned is that we plan for X number of days and X number of hours. And then suddenly we start testing children for the final exit at the beginning of November. So what has happened with the closure in December? Because our district officers are demanding promotion schedules by mid-November. And that is what happens to time. Time is not always what people in head office write down on a schedule. It is the reality of what happens in the school. Consult the teachers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Basil. And I've been such a bad chair because I've went over time. And I guess it's because of how discussion has been going. I'm going to ask that we put up the poll, and can I ask all the attendees to just look at the poll and just try and answer those questions that will be put up as honestly as you can. I'm just going to check with Asanya. Asanya, is it on? Okay, the poll should be there. While people are engaged in the poll, there's a couple of questions that I'm looking at from the chat, and one of them I'd like Dr. Whitten and Dr. Nako to respond. It's around the question of working in silos, which I think it was asked by Linda, and let me see if it's Linda. It's about working in, oh, it's by Nosipo. It's about working in silos and what can NGOs do to better support the schooling community around psychological trauma of learners, and I'm assuming of teachers as well, or the schooling community. Dr. Nako?
Thank you, Tshepo. And that is a very good question Nosipo asked there, and it is very important because it is something we just identified as COVID struck us. It is a situation that has not been addressed historically, and the disconnect between the school and the services available to the school locally, regionally, and nationally. Schools, as we have come to learn, do not have even a tiny little pocketbook where they have numbers of contact persons who to contact in a case of substance abuse, who to contact in a case of verbal violence or any violence, grief counseling, time management, you name it, and who to contact in a case of grief, sudden, unexpected loss, even a number of a local doctor in case of an epileptic seizure in the school. They just don't have those numbers. The principal's office doesn't have these numbers, just a list of numbers. So that is a really good question. And I think the word I've heard used often in this forum is solidarity. The word I've heard used often in this forum is holding environments for schools, working with districts, moving forward to establish, no matter how small, a resource book of available potential providers for psychosocial support. Who are they? And link those providers with schools. Nothing fancy about getting people from elsewhere, but those that are already in existence, just link them to schools, who to conduct in the school, and who should the school conduct in the office, and have that as a district resource and a school resource that both the district management team and the school management team will have access to.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nako. Dr. Whitten, how do we make sure that we don't work in silos, and what role can NGOs play?
Yes, so just quickly, I mean, isn't this an opportune moment for us to break some of the silos? So, you know, social services, the health department, the education department, there are no interministerial working groups or task teams that's focusing on supporting schools at the moment. So we have to use our imagination in terms of how do we put together a comprehensive package of services that we offer to our schools. Included in those services, we draw on the strengths of our NGO sector. There are numerous education-based NGOs. So we have to use our imagination, and we have to use the opportunity that the crisis presents us to be able to do that. My last point quickly, Tshepo, the new work of leaders also, for me, would be leading beyond the school walls. If I'm a principal of a school with my SMT and my SGB, I'd be looking at how I build relationships, not only with my parents, but with the local clinic, you know, with local businesses, in terms of supporting teaching and learning and the well-being and health and development of our children. So, you know, that's another way of breaking out of a silo. As school leaders, we should not only be thinking about ourselves as just school leaders in terms of a building, we should think of ourselves as school community leaders, where our leadership, reach, and influence extends beyond the boundaries of our school. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Dr. Whitson. I'm going to just wrap up, and I really hope that people have found this webinar quite insightful. The Phepha uFunde campaign has had 9 radio broadcasts thus far. The last one is coming up on Radio 2000 this Saturday from 9 until 10. Please do tune in. And for those who have not followed us on our social media platforms, we've got a Twitter account, and also we've got a Facebook account. Please like us on Facebook. It's Phepha uFunde on Facebook, and it's Phepha uFunde on Twitter. This is where you'll, and also on the website, I see the website link has been posted in the chat. Please do look at, spend some time on the website and look at what the campaign has to offer. I'd like to thank everybody, all the attendees who have stayed until thus far. Like I said, I've been a bad chair because I've really been quite generous with time. But most importantly, I'd like to thank the panelists who have been quite generous with sharing their insights with us. But most importantly is and I saw there was a comment around thinking ahead. We're not just going to be reactionary come January 2021 and pretend as if this is something that we're encountering because we all said Happy New Year. But we're already now thinking, and I think that's what we've learned from this year, that we need to build resilience. And the most important word is around solidarity, solidarity, solidarity. And to the schooling community in particular, and this is a message that I think is of hope. How do we lead beyond the schooling walls, if I could use Dr. Whitton's call to say, school leaders need to think beyond what the school offers from 8 o'clock in the morning until after school, but what else can they offer beyond? And I think there are challenges that we're facing which are monumental, which are historical, and none of them are insurmountable, provided we continue to work together in the spirit of solidarity. So with that said, thank you very much. And let us all continue to remain safe. Let us all wear our masks, wash our hands, keep a safe distance from each other, and make sure that we share with our loved ones and cherish the moments we have, because I think this year has really been tough on everybody, and we all are feeling it. So with that said, thank you very much to the panelists, to the attendees. Thank you very much for the questions and comments. And let us continue to make sure that we safeguard teaching and learning in the country for the benefit of our children. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well done, Tshepo. Thank you. Thank you, colleagues.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah.